Hi there, welcome back. We're now moving on to a short set of lectures covering 3 topic areas. We've got 2 lectures, and in the first one we'll be looking at depression and the use of antidepressant drugs, and then in the follow-up we'll be looking at the areas of psychotic behaviour and anxiety, and there we'll deal with what we refer to as antipsychotic medication and anxiolytic medication. Depression belongs to the group of conditions known as the affective disorders. These involve disturbances of mood where things are affected like your cognitive changes, emotional symptoms, etc. And that results in changes in our behaviour, in energy, in appetite and in sleep. Those are referred to as the biological symptoms that are perhaps more obvious. How a person's feeling emotionally on the inside is difficult sometimes to perceive, but depression and the affective disorders do manifest themselves on the outside, so there are visible things that people can pick up on. Now, what we refer to here is what we call the pathological extremes of the normal continuum. What that means is that in the course of any day or in the course of any week or whatever, we have a range of emotions. We have some days where we're feeling high, good, positive, and other days where perhaps we don't feel as great, we're a bit low, we're a bit fed up, but we're not actually depressed. So what you've got is this pattern that goes up and down, and that up and down is giving us highs and emotional lows. It's when you go beyond that and you get to the extremes where the highs move into, if you like, manic behaviour and the lows move into depression. You're at the extremes of that continuum, and that's when it really starts to affect our day-to-day existence. That's what we're talking about here. So you can look at it with these extremes in 2 ways. You've got what they refer to as unipolar or bipolar. Unipolar means that the person is actually suffering from what you would term mania or manic behaviour, or depressive behaviour, depressive illness. Bipolar means they are manic depressive, fluctuating between the 2 extremes. What we're going to focus on for the purposes of this lecture is depression. Now, when you speak to people and look at people who are suffering from depression, what you find is there are a range of symptoms or things that they say in terms of the way they feel, and these are common terms that come up. Misery, malaise, despair, guilt, apathy, indecisiveness. There's also signs of low energy, of fatigue, changes in sleeping pattern, appetite loss, and in the most extreme conditions, suicidal thoughts. And it's those changes in sleeping patterns and the appetite loss that are often the things that are most obvious to other people, that other people can actually pick up on. When we're dealing with depression, you can break it down into 2 main types: reactive depression and endogenous depression. Reactive depression is usually when there's a clear psychological cause that you can pick up on. That might be a bereavement, the loss of a job, the breakup of a relationship, but there appears to be something happened that affects the life of the individual. There are fewer symptoms there, and there's less likelihood of a biological disturbance that we talked about before, and this affects about 3 to 10% of the population. The reason that spread is so big is not everyone who suffers from a reactive depression will necessarily go and seek medical help about it. So if it's a reactive depression and it's happening as a result of something that's occurred in their life, when that has, for want of a better phrase, passed, they may not be depressed anymore. They may move on themselves, and they may not have pitched up. What you find though is the incidence increases with age. And people do postulate that might be due to the fact that maybe life-changing events have much more impact when you're older. So maybe the loss of a loved one, a bereavement, makes them reflect on their own mortality as they get older, or the breakup of a relationship. They might think, at my age I would find someone else. Or they lose a job, they might think no one's going to employ me at my age. Therefore that might manifest itself in a completely different way in an older person. And also you find it's more common in females, the reactive depression. And again, people do postulate that that's perhaps down to the fact that, if you ask a female how she's feeling, she will tell you how she's feeling. Whereas you often ask a male how they're feeling and they'll say, yeah, fine, okay, good. There is that difference that wouldn't be a rule if there wasn't exceptions, but you do get this idea that women perhaps are more comfortable expressing how they're feeling, more open about talking about their feelings, and that might be why it appears to be more common. We then also got the endogenous depression, where there is no clear cause. This just seems to be something inside the pathways in the brain. This can result in much more severe symptoms, including suicidal thoughts. And there is also a greater likelihood of the biological disturbances, so that appetite loss and adjusted sleeping patterns are more obvious in an endogenous depression. This appears to affect a smaller group of the population, only 1%, and it tends to be more common in early adulthood. So it's not, age doesn't seem to be the risk here. And there's also an equal effect on males and females. So it does have slightly different pattern, this version of depression, compared to the reactive. Now, it's important to get that distinction. It's important to try and get to the root of whether it's an endogenous or a reactive, because evidence would suggest that the endogenous depression is the one that responds best to drugs. That's not to say that drugs interventions don't have a part to play in reactive, but the endogenous does respond better, and by and large reactive might respond better to alternative approaches such as counselling, behavioural therapy, etc., etc. Now, the exact cause is unknown, but a lot of the research and a lot of the medicines and pharmaceutical agents revolve around the monoamine theory. And that says that abnormalities within the monoamine systems, that's noradrenaline and serotonin, specifically within the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, that's what's responsible for it. And it causes an abnormality in neurotransmission. Basically, it's a low level of monoamines in the synapses. That's what's thought to be part of the reason. And so it's that reduced serotonergic and noradrenergic neurotransmission that's partly to blame. That is, the neurons fire, but for whatever reason, there will be fewer serotonergic or noradrenergic molecules in the synapse, therefore fewer working on the postsynaptic neurons. So it will affect the processing of the information, specifically through the limbic system. Now, the hypothesis states that that depression is caused by low levels of monoamines, and we've just said that there we're talking about noradrenaline and serotonin specifically. Serotonin being 5-hydroxytryptamine or 5-HT. And we're going to come on and look at this kind of hypothesis and try and get to the root of whether it's a good enough hypothesis to explain every aspect of depression. Basically what we're talking about here is, this is an example of a synapse, but it's a generic synapse. You'll see here that you've got noradrenaline there and serotonin there. Now, that would never happen, that in the same terminal you would have both molecules. So what that's meaning is that dependent on the neuron will either be releasing noradrenaline to go and work on receptors, or it will be releasing serotonin. And what this is showing you is that the noradrenaline or the serotonin get released, they work on the postsynaptic receptors, and those postsynaptic receptors produce an effect. And there are also uptake mechanisms for serotonin and noradrenaline. And because we know that, there are various compounds indicated on this slide that we're going to come back to that allow you to manipulate the noradrenergic and or the serotonergic synapse. So this theory seems to be a good theory because it shows that drugs that reduce monoamines are actually able to induce a depression. Drugs like reserpine, for example, will lower the levels of monoamines in the synapse. And then the drugs that increase the availability of the monoamines, such as the tricyclic antidepressants, which we're going to come on and talk about, they seem to be antidepressant. And then when you take cerebrospinal fluid samples through a spinal tap so a CSF sample from a depressed patient, you find that the monoamine levels in the sample and the metabolites of the monoamines, they're at a much lower concentration. So that would suggest that there would be, if there's less of those molecules found in the cerebrospinal fluid, that indicates that there will be a lower concentration of them within the central nervous system. And that seems to back up the theory. The reason we're still calling it a theory, though, is because there's evidence that it goes against the theory, if you like. So some compounds can increase monoamine availability, which you would think that means, oh, more monoamines means antidepressant action, but they're not antidepressant. So the amphetamines and cocaine will increase the levels of monoamines, but have no antidepressant action whatsoever. We also have drugs that are referred to as atypical antidepressants, which seem to work without, and their action can't be fully explained by a manipulation of the monoamine system. And then we've got the idea of the therapeutic delay. You take the medication elevates the monoamines almost immediately, but it can take 2 to 3 weeks before you see a therapeutic effect. And so therefore that delay suggests that there are other pathways and other processes involved. Now, these other things say that, well, it might be that, you've got other transmitters involved, and one that always crops up is the GABA. GABA is the major inhibitory transmitter in the brain. So, gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, could it be that the GABA neurons are firing more and inhibiting the serotonergic and noradrenergic neurons, making them fire less? Could be that. There could also be various things like the endogenous opiates might have a role, endorphins and kephalins, they're postulated, and various second messenger systems. So what's actually going on inside the cell takes time to change. So you might boost the levels might start to work on the receptors, but it takes a while for the internal machinery to get back to being able to respond to the presence of the monoamine. That might be another explanation. Now, so the treatment approaches that we're going to then summarise at the moment revolve around enhancing the monoamine levels, working on the receptors, and working on the enzyme that breaks down monoamine. And we're going to look at some examples as we work our way through the remainder of this presentation. On each slide, you'll see that we're talking about the different classes, and there are some that we have highlighted in red. Those are the ones we're going to focus on in more depth at the moment. If there's any more pharmacology in the future of depression, then you may well get more information on the rest. But we're going to be looking at the tricyclic antidepressants, and I've given some examples here. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and I've given some examples there. The best example of all is probably Prozac. That's probably the antidepressant that most people know about. On the second slide, we're going to be focusing in on the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors are the drugs that block monoamine oxidase, which is the enzyme that breaks down the monoamines, noradrenaline and serotonin. So if you block the enzyme that breaks them down, you block the breakdown and the levels become elevated. Now, the tricyclic antidepressants, we talked about amitriptyline, imipramine, nortriptyline, lefepramine, some examples there. These inhibit the reuptake of the monoamine neurotransmitters. So, in the synapse, what we've got here is, you'll see that those drugs there, the tricyclics, are indicating a negative mark onto both noradrenaline reuptake and serotonin reuptake. That means that the tricyclics block here. They stop the reuptake of both these transmitters, therefore, depending on the synapse, you're going to get more noradrenaline or more serotonin here. So the low levels are elevated because of the blockage of the reuptake, therefore there's more opportunity for them to work postsynaptically and redress the balance caused by the low levels. Just nicking back a slide though, what this shows you is that different drugs have different selectivity. They both affect the uptake of serotonin and noradrenaline, but amitriptyline and imipramine are more likely to affect the uptake of serotonin, whereas nortriptyline and lefepramine are more likely to affect the uptake of noradrenaline. But all four of them affect both. It's just a different way that they attack the problem. This is just another little diagram to show you a slightly different view of it. So what we've got there on the left-hand side is we've got the serotonergic neuron, and those little blue T's are the serotonin molecules, and they're going to cross and work in serotonin receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. And then the middle one in green is noradrenaline, and what we see there is noradrenaline molecules going across and working on their receptor. And then you'll see on each of those first two neurons you have a blue and a green square, which is the 5-HT reuptake transporter, and then the noradrenaline reuptake transporter. And what you're seeing there is that the tricyclic antidepressant, which is in yellow, is able to block both of those uptake mechanisms. And the other thing it's showing you there is that they have no effect on cholinergic receptors and cholinergic systems. They're specifically looking at the monoamine systems. So it's just another little diagrammatic take on things. When you're looking at them, what you'll see in the table is they have side effects, and the side effects can be, some of them can start to impact on acetylcholine and have anticholinergic effects. Some of them can have sedatives, some can be stimulant, some can be seizure inducing or eleptogenic, and some can be toxic and overdose. And what you're seeing there is the more pluses you have, the more of that effect you see. And what you notice is that as you move down through things, the drugs at the bottom, the nortriptyline and the lefepramine, which are the ones that are antidepressant, affect both noradrenaline and serotonin, but the bottom two have more of an impact on noradrenaline, and the top two have more of an impact on serotonin. But those ones at the bottom have less anticholinergic activity than the others, have less or no sedative action, they have a limited amount of stimulant effect, but not much, they have less or no epileptogenic properties, and they have less toxicity and overdose. So these, if you like, the bottom two, are the ones that are less likely to cause a side effect. So it seems to be with a tricyclic, you are targeting the uptake of both noradrenaline and serotonin, but if they're better at blocking noradrenaline, they are less likely to induce side effects. We then move on to probably what's the daddy of them all, Prozac. Probably everybody, even people that don't know anything about serotonin pharmacology, about depression, have heard of Prozac. You know, I think, I'll be seeing my mother soon, it's her 89th birthday coming up. I'm sure when I speak to my mum, if I said, have you heard of Prozac, her answer would be yes. It's that common. People are just aware of it. It's such a big, high-profile medication. And so therefore, it is known as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it kind of does exactly what it says in the tin. Whereas with the others, the tricyclics block the reuptake of both noradrenaline and serotonin. These drugs only block the reuptake of serotonin, the SSRIs. They selectively block or inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. And we've got examples there. Probably citalopram and fluoxetine and paroxetine are the best known ones, but Prozac and Seroxat are probably the trade names that most people will be aware of. Now where these are working, these sort of SSRIs, you'll see them down here, only inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin. They don't affect the uptake of noradrenaline whatsoever. So that's just to give you an idea of where they're working on this diagram. So they reduce the neuronal uptake of serotonin back into the presynaptic terminal. They have little or no effect on noradrenaline. Now the idea is there that what will happen is you'll get an initial increase in 5-HT concentration, and that leads to the downregulation of what they call the autoreceptors. Now the autoreceptors, we'll go back one, the autoreceptors are found up here. Now when they're activated, you will get a reduction down here and a reduction in release. But what will actually happen is that will be overcome when you elevate the levels, and you will actually get the upregulation and the increased release at the terminal, and so you'll get It's a strange one because if I go back to that diagram again, sorry, what you would think is if the 5-HT that's extra here is able to work here and it inhibits firing, that surely releases more into the, will release less into the gap. So it almost negates its own function. But actually, what you find is when the levels rise, you get a downregulation of those autoreceptors. So the sudden surge and increase causes a downturn in the production of the autoreceptors. They're less likely to inhibit the release of more serotonin, therefore more serotonin is released. And at the same time, there's not been taken back up. So more of it stays around in the cleft, in synaptic cleft, and going to work on the postsynaptic receptors. Comparing these side effects to the side effects of the TCAs, they're very unlikely to cause sedation. They're very unlikely to upset the balance of the body in terms of energy balance, so for little weight gain. They have no cardiac effects because they're not affecting noradrenaline. Although they can cause nausea, abdominal pain and diarrhea, they can have a gastric side effect. And they can cause some levels of anxiety. They might cause anorexia because of the disturbance on the satiety mechanisms, and they can reduce libido or sex drive because serotonin also has a role to play there. What we're seeing here is because of the fact that serotonin is not just a neurotransmitter that's found in the limbic system of the brain. It's found throughout the body and throughout the brain and has a number of other actions. And when you start to alter those other actions, those other pathways, those other areas where serotonin is now elevated, that's where the side effects kick in. The final ones we're going to look at in this little session are the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. As we said, monoamine oxidase is the enzyme that breaks down the serotonin. So it produces the metabolites, and the monoamine oxidase inhibitors inhibit that enzyme, therefore stop the breakdown. So therefore more serotonin and more noradrenaline is going to be available because you're not breaking it down as much. Examples of that are nardil and parmate. You might see them as phenelzine and tranylcypromine. And basically they inhibit monoamine oxidase A, therefore noradrenaline and serotonin are not broken down, and therefore you get elevation of those neurotransmitter levels. You can get a dose-related hypotension because of the vascular action of the extra noradrenaline causing a vasodilation effect, and that can give you reduced venous return, and that reduced venous return can cause an postural hypertension or a dose-related hypertension. You can also get irritability, and you can also get insomnia as a result of the increases in the levels of both serotonin and noradrenaline. Examples, you've got another example here, a drug called Manarix. Again, can cause sleep disturbances, can cause dizziness and headache, but again, it's a reversible inhibitor of the enzyme, therefore it elevates the levels. Now the key thing is, and this is where, this takes a whole other lecture really, and something that might be covered elsewhere, but drugs are only part of the answer. And they're usually only for moderate, severe or protracted symptoms. They might be used in mild depression but there's no evidence in a mild form or in a reactive form that the drugs are in any way better or in any way, in fact, they're not even as effective really as therapy. So sometimes it's better to go down the therapeutic path, but sometimes when you're into the more severe, long-lasting symptoms, you might need the drug there to try and balance the neurotransmitter systems to allow time for the therapeutic interventions, the counselling therapeutic, the behavioural therapeutic interventions to work better. So the key thing to take home from this is the idea that the key neurotransmitters implicated are serotonin and also noradrenaline. The theory states that the depression is caused by low levels of these neurotransmitters in the synapse, and the drugs that we have looked at today are about elevating the levels of those synapses by either blocking the reuptake or blocking the enzyme that breaks them down. Thank you.